everyone, welcome to the MOOCs on media and human rights. Before we reach to the question of human rights, let's question why media is important and how does it work for spreading of human rights. Actually, media is an essential pillar of democratic state. How? It informs about your rights, it creates awareness about the rights and also the infringement of rights, and educates about the rights too. So, it's all about rights and duties, and hence lead people towards participation in democracy in a responsible manner. What is the role of media? Actually, media widens the reach of human rights movements through showing the plight and protests of people asking for protection of their rights on issues such as slave trade, human trafficking, refugee crisis, racial discrimination, and many more issues, where we observe the breaching of human rights, where we observe that one individual is not treated as human. So, it works on those questions. Media also has a role to preserve the diversity of context while advocating for human rights in different frames, such as individual, community-based, universal. It is important to set the narrative with right approach through diverse media processes in relation to the context. So, here one thing is important, that it is not about only the enjoyment of individual rights, but it is also about the responsibility towards community and your environment. So, it educates about the duties along with enjoyment of the rights. So, what is the concept of human rights? From the historic times, the societies over the world have witnessed the inequality based on color, gender and class, and we have observed right from the history that how slaves had been treated as non-human in the ancient societies and even in the medieval societies. So, such inequalities have been practiced through banning individual groups, communities from political, economic, social participation. Here the word participation is very much important, because the people who were not a part of human rights frame, they were treated as exclusionary and alienated to the society. So, the value of being was not there. The situation necessitated to formally define human rights. Thus, the human rights provide for equality based enjoyment of human dignity and well-being of all. So, if we trace the history and development of human rights, we find there were power relationships based on the ownership of property. We see the struggle for equality, and we are again and again going back to the example of slaves in the ancient history for to make it more understood. So, the traces from the ancient history to the milestones achieved in the modern times tell the history of the development of human rights too. So, here let us understand human rights journey from ancient history. So, it was the first of all Hammurabi's codes, where we see that the codes or the formal laws were established to protect the poor against the powerful. So, it was called that it was the laws which were framed to save weaker sections. So, the Babylonian king Hammurabi issued the written public laws for the first time in the Middle East and the world history too. So, it included civil laws, marriage and family laws, property laws, and even the laws related to fair wages. Remember, it was said to be the laws, the codes for the weaker section. So, those were the first instance of you can say the imprints of human rights in the ancient history. So, but the question was, whether Hammurabi's code were really based on inequality, were really based on equality. No, actually those were not based on equality, rather those were unequal, because when we go through the complete set of codes, we find that there were lesser punishments if the crime was committed by a person from elite class, and if and there were harsh punishment for the crime committed by a person from weaker section on the elite class. So again, the slaves and women were never treated as equal as elite class in the rule of laws. Then we have, on the same Babylonian ground, we have Cyrus cylinder, which was established by Cyrus II of Prussia, who invaded Babylon, and he set all the slaves, all the prisoners free, and that is why Cyrus cylinder is known to have a mark of equality in history. So known for freedom given to slaves to return to their homelands, and also it set religious freedom throughout the Prussian Empire. So people were free to enjoy and to go for their religion practices, and they were the slaves were freed to go to their homeland. So in that manner, King Cyrus II was humanitarian in his approach and is known for human rights pathfinder, you may say. Then in India we have our own example. We can say that it is a kind of global example when we call the name of Mauryan King Ashoka. So it was all humanitarian and universalism as the core values of Indian philosophy, which were spread over the world with the message of Mauryan King Ashoka, who spread the message of Buddhism, peace, love and harmony to the world. Moving to the medieval history and formation of human rights, we see that the whole European history is based on the 14th and 15th century Renaissance, and then to 18th century Enlightenment movement. The complete frame is set for human rights engagement. So here we have Magna Carta as the first great charter, which actually set the rules for king as equal to the parliamentarians. So the law of land was declared as supreme. The king of land was brought under equality before the law for the first time. But it was not all equality before the law in Magna Carta. It was again exclusionary in some terms, like it was not meant for unfree peasants, those were who were treated as slaves again. So majority of common people, including women, were out of the ambit of right to justice and fair trial. So it was not totally egalitarian as it is said, though we all know that it became the foundation of Universal Declaration of Human Rights later. So that is again a fact. So later we have the Petition of Right. The most striking feature of the petition of English Parliament was the abolition of imprisonment of the people without cause. So the Bill of Rights states political and civil rights, protection of free speech in Parliament. In England, this bill set the stage for freedom to elect the members of Parliament and culture of debate in Parliament. So we see that it set a stage for freedom of expression when it comes to the parliamentarian debates. Then we have a total era of Reformation, Renaissance and Enlightenment, and it actually led us towards modern world of human rights. So from 14th century to 17th century we had Renaissance, which is called the first wave of human rights movement. So it started with religious rights, then we see that the civil rights also became a part of it. So the important philosopher of those time were John Locke, Voltaire and Rousseau, who actually promulgated the idea of human life with liberty, equality and independence with philosophy of natural rights. And natural rights were actually individualistic in approach. Here we can have a very beautiful example of a small baby. When a baby is born, means it is his or her right to life, which is given by nature to him or her. Similarly, a baby is not attached with any socially given affiliation like caste, creed, gender. It is all later which is given to him or her. So, at the time of birth, till he or she is baby, he or she enjoys the life to the right to life as well as right to liberty. So, he or she may smile whatever time he or she likes, he or she may cry whenever he or she likes. So, so on and so forth. Similarly, when we see the equality in terms of holding property which is given to the human beings by nature, like food, like shelter and other natural resources. So, on the basis of that philosophy of a child till his being in human being, it is all natural rights given by the nature. That was the philosophy given by Locke, Voltaire and Rousseau. So, the modern liberalism finds the foundation here, you can say. Again, we have Protestant reformations started by Martin Luther in 16th century Germany on the same lines, and that was the starting of religious movement in throughout the history of Europe, you may say. So, we see that the religious movement started by Martin Luther in Germany spreads in other parts like Spain and France and other parts of Europe all together in no time. So, we see that how the religious freedom is sought to be asked for everyone. So, it was not a property of some church or like Martin Luther translated Bible in English from Latin. So, it was so that it is provided to every common man, because religion belongs to every common man. So, that was the philosophy, and here we see that how participation as an element of human rights starts to evolve. So, again we reach in France the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen that states, all men are equal and born free, all have civil and political rights, all have rights to think and speak, all have rights to property, that is private property. This French declaration also stated that all will be presumed innocent until proven guilty. So, here again, if you notice, the women were excluded from those rights. So, that is again a kind of lacuna you find in formation of such human rights laws in the history. So, the major drawback, as we have stated, of the Declaration of the Right of Man and of the Citizen was that of women were excluded from the citizenship and were not the part of the people born equal and free. So, then we will come to the US Bill of Rights. So, bill was based on the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. These were free exercise of religion, freedom of speech and assembly, security of a free state, the right to a fair, speedy trial and protection against unreasonable searches and seizure. So, the amendment 2nd of the Bill of Rights also gives the right to people to keep and bear arms. So, if you observe, this particular amendment is being protested against the citizens of America today in the wake of increasing criminal offences, where hundreds of people have been killed by the culprits. So, the same amendment is used for violation of human rights. So this is protested against. So then we come to the Geneva Conventions. These were the war treaties associated with the protection of human rights of the prisoners of war, especially in relation to human treatment of sick and wounded. Then we have the whole history of women's suffrage, because throughout the history we are noticing that women as a class were excluded, women as a gender were excluded totally from the human rights frame. So we see women's suffrage, there was a continuous struggle going on in terms of women's rights. So the beginning of civil and political rights for women were with right to vote, led by Kate Shepherd. So that was the women's right movement in 1893 in New Zealand, and it became a success. And now if you have a chance to look at the currency of New Zealand, you will find Kate Shepherd's photograph on the currency notes. So the modern history, where we reach to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it actually is based on exploitation of human beings, the gory wars where thousands of peoples were killed. So we see that after World War I, the leaders initiate the siege of the gory game, and that resulted in the foundations of League of Nations in 1919. Then again we see a complete gory picture at the time of World War II, and we also faced the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which became a pathfinder, or you can say that the stage where world leaders sat together to discuss that there should be no more wars. So the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is based on that, on the concept of rights of individual. The UN Declaration of Human Rights is a part of International Bill of Human Rights. It makes provision for 30 articles in the Charter. UN Charter on Human Rights talk about dignity, equal and inalienable rights. So no one can detach those human rights from any individual. So no one can violate those rights. So those rights became the foundation for freedom, justice and peace in the world. There were 30 articles, there are 30 articles mentioned in the UN Charter of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Those centered around right of life, dignity and protection. Here again the word dignity becomes important, because even if you look at the crisis and situations of for example refugees today, they ask for the right to dignity and dignified life. So you can relate those concepts with the human rights struggles all over the world. So again we have International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Their cultural rights, we are going to discuss it further in the next segment, where we will be talking about relativism in human rights perspective, and also the community based rights. So here those rights, the covenants talk about that. Then we have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights too. We have one human rights organization which is one of the biggest organizations in the world, that is Amnesty International, and the founder is the British lawyer Peter Benenson, who started with the concept of Amnesty International that looks into the human rights violation or even the protection of human rights, and rates the country according the various countries accordingly. On our soul we find a lot of examples where we see torchbearers of human rights, because we were ourselves were living as a colony under imperialistic powers. Who knows human rights better than us? So we had with humanitarian non-violent movement of Mahatma Gandhi that emerged as a crusader for human rights. We also see truth as you may say founding stone for right to be informed. Then we have a similar movement against caste-based discrimination and human rights violation that was launched by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in India. So, according to the scholars, the history of human rights can be summarized as individual liberties, social welfare, sustainable development, peace and fraternity at global level. And here we arrive at the formal definition of human rights as propounded by the UN. So, it states human rights are rights inherent to all human beings regardless of race, sex, nationality, ethnicity, language, religion or any other status. Here we have to understand the UN's concept of human right that is based on universal approach. It is egalitarian, it is based on again natural rights that deals with individual as the core, as the center of the human rights rather than community based or relativity based human rights. So, there are different paradigms to understand the concept of human rights in contexts, in various contexts, in terms of diversity too. So, here apart from individualism we have rights of society. So, here we have positive and negative rights in terms of action and non-action. For example, positive rights ask you to do something while negative rights ask you not to breach, not to violate other person's right. So, this leads to the concept of duty. These are actually the principles which are soul of human rights, that is liberty, equality and dignity. Here if we look at the theories of rights, we have at the beginning Plato and Aristotle which who actually propound the universalism and justice as the principle of life. Then we have John Locke who promotes natural rights in terms of life, liberty and property. Again individual freedom is propounded by Immanuel Kant, Thomas Paine and Karl Popper. Foundation of modern liberalism is based on these individualistic principles which we have just explained and discussed, and John Stuart Mill, Adam Smith and David Ricardo were the liberal economists and philosophers who actually further this modern liberalism in the sphere of economy by the concept of laissez-faire. Again it asks for decentralization of power and laissez-faire. We have John Rawls. Now we are moving to the society based theories of human rights. So, John Rawls who propounded the theory of social contract, like where we see that individual is a part of society rather than society is made by individual. So, here it asks for duties, it asks for social contract, and through social contract John Rawls states that how individuals have given consent for a legitimate authority to rule and to govern. So, they have a cohesive relationship and it is not based on exploitative power relationship. So, again Montesquieu states that separation of political power among executive, legislature and judiciary. So, we have already discussed negative and positive rights theories and duties and rights too. So, we are moving further, moving ahead with how these theories of individualism and societies which actually become the notion of universal human rights approach or paradigm governed by UN has been seen with a critical frame by especially by Jan Servais and Chris Verschutten, where they talk about the binaries or the conflict between traditional and modernity, universality and relativism, individualism and collectivism. So, we have the complete charter of 30 articles divided into various parts, right from the individual rights, the state responsibility and the individual and state duties as well, which can be understood with the UN Charter of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, moving further, we come to our Indian Constitution of Human Rights. Here we have complete parts explicitly given for which declare human rights with perspective, like part 3 that deals with fundamental rights and part 4 that deals with directive principles of state policy. So, here if we go for particular articles, we have article 14, 15 and 16 that mandates equality before the law, equal protection of the laws. Then we have directive principles of the state that talk about affirmative actions for protection of those rights from state's viewpoint. Then we have, if we look at the relationship between media, society and human rights, we find that media is a social institution. It is a kind of cultural practice that functions around to impart information, it educates, it socializes and it actually reflects in social behavior of people. So, the relationship between political systems and media are reflected well in power theories and normative theories of press, where power theories states that it is not only through coercive actions, but when any state or any power entity wants to be in power position, it has to take the consent of people. So, normative theories of press are again based on the same political relationship, political structures and their relationship with the media and how media content is framed. As Walter Lippmann has said, news is not a mirror of social conditions, but the report of an aspect that has obstructed itself. So, we have two basic processes when we observe media that is important to learn to see whether you are not being a part of propagation or some agenda is not set with some particular intention. So, we have the concept of framing and priming, where we see that how content is given a single narrative or perspective. So, here we see that marginalized identities and their representations in media is also based on some kind of narrative set in the media. So, various social identities embedded in Indian social structure, if we observe, are caste, class, gender, ethnicity, minorities. We have representation of social identities, for example, caste, where we find that the complexity of caste, that the discrimination with a particular caste has well been depicted beautifully in films like Diksha and Rudali, and they leave the audience with questions whether it is right or wrong. So, when it comes to the class representation, unfortunately the class as haves and have-nots do not occur after the later stage of 1980s and 1990s. So, earlier we had such films like Naya Daur and Trishul and many more, where we saw that class conflict, and when we say class conflict, we can see that dichotomy in terms of urban rural regionalism as well as urban divide. So, how we can tackle or how we can spread awareness and enjoy human rights and create a total environment of human rights, sustainable human rights. So, we have participatory media to sensitize the marginalized groups towards their human rights. It works upon 5 policy areas for democratic communication rights: access to information, the availability of information, media competency, dialogue and privacy. So, to conclude, With this discussion, we expect you to acquire an understanding of human rights and its global and Indian perspectives, to develop thought process to discuss the emerging issues of human rights, civil liberties, international humanitarian crisis, and to have skills to analyze the media processes in relation to the representation of human rights issues, and also to know the strength of participatory media as to achieve an inclusive, equality-based society. So, we all can be participative in participatory media to create a world of human rights where dignity, equality of all is secured and sustained. Thank you very much for this session.